without further ado, عن أبي محمد عبد الله بن عمر بن العاص رضي الله تعالى عنهما قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون حواه تبعا لما جئت به. حديث حسن رويناه في كتاب الحجة بإسناد صحيح. So this was a hadith that was narrated by a Sahabi we have not come across before. So we'll give an introduction to him, inshallah. But the translation is, so this was a hadith that was mentioned by a Sahabi named Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-As. May Allah be pleased with them. He narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said that none of you will truly believe until their hawa, their desires or their inclinations, fall in line with what I have brought. And this was a hadith that Imam Nawawi narrated and said was sahih, a correct narration. So this is a Sahabi I've not come across before, so we'll give an introduction to who he is. His name is Abi Muhammad Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-As ibn Wa'il ibn Hisham ibn Sa'id ibn Sa'ad ibn Sahm ibn Umar ibn Lu'ay ibn Ghalib. And this Ibn Lu'ay ibn Ghalib is where his lineage meets with the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Feel free to move forward if you can't hear in the back. And so his lineage meets with the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ a few generations back. He's known as Abu Muhammad, and some also call him Abu Nusayr or Abu Abdul Rahman. So the origin of his original name is actually As. So he was named after his grandfather. So his father is Umar ibn As, and so he was named As ibn Umar ibn As. So one day the Prophet ﷺ was at a funeral, and a bunch of the Sahabas came and attended, and he was amongst them. And so he was a young man at this time. And so he asked him, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name is As." And he turned to the young man next to him and he said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name is As." And he turns to the third young man next to them and he's like, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name is As." And so the Prophet ﷺ said that from now on you'll be called Abdurrahman to all three of them. And so his name was changed to Abdurrahman because As, the meaning of As is like someone who disobeys. And so he changed the name to Abdurrahman, someone who serves Allah. And it's just like maybe a side note here. This was something that the Prophet ﷺ did many times. When someone becomes Muslim, or if you're Muslim, it's not like a necessity to change your name, but the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to name our children good names. And if you had a name and you became a Muslim and the name was not a pleasant name, he would recommend that you change it. Because he said that the names that we're named with affect our lives, like they affect our characteristics, they impact us. And so he said, name your children good names, take up good names yourself. And there's an example of a Sahabi, his name was Hazan, and so which is like sadness or grief. And so the Prophet ﷺ recommended that he change his name to Sahel, like simplicity or ease. And he actually declined. He said that he didn't want to change his name. And so from his offspring, his grandson was actually a scholar, and he said that my family was afflicted with so much grief and sadness after that. And so it's just an interesting side note. And the best names are those that obviously attribute some sort of servitude towards Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ loved from amongst those the most Abdullah and Abdurrahman. You can be the servant of any of the names of Allah. And after the servants of the names of Allah, there would also be the names of the prophets. And those are also very blessed names, obviously, because Allah chose to name His prophets those names. But it doesn't have to be an Arabic name. It's very, Islam is not an Arab religion, it's a religion for all people, and so it's not necessarily that people be named Arabic names, it's just good names as a whole. So that's kind of like a tangent on names. Abdullah's mother's name was Rayta bint Munabih bint Hajjaj, and she gave bay'ah to the Prophet ﷺ also. His father was very famous, maybe you've all heard the name of the Sahabi, Umar ibn al-As. So his son, the one that we're talking about, Abdullah, he became Muslim before his father. His father became Muslim later on in the 7th or 8th year after Hijrah. He became Muslim with Khalid ibn al-Walid and another Sahabi that went with him as well. And so his father, Amr ibn al-As, was very famous for many reasons. He was the Quraysh's ambassador, he was an intellectual, and he's also famous in our tradition because he was the one who conquered Egypt, and not through fighting, but mostly with diplomacy. There was very, very, very minimal fighting and bloodshed in the course of his conquest of Egypt, which was by many people at his time was considered like a miracle. And he was an amazing diplomat, very intellectual, and he was able to open up the cities of Egypt with very little fighting. And so what's interesting is his father, Amr ibn al-As, was amongst the nobles of Quraysh, and when the Prophet ﷺ signed with Quraysh the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Quraysh thought that they had won against the Prophet ﷺ because they had like a very unfavorable treaty towards him. So the Prophet ﷺ had like unfavorable terms for the Muslims. And so Quraysh thought this was a victory, but Amr al-As said that this is actually a major defeat. And he recognized kind of like he had this amazing foresight. And he says it's going to come down to two things. Either Quraysh wins, which he said is like he's not going to bet his money on it. He didn't think Quraysh was going to win. Or the Prophet ﷺ would eventually, within 2 or 3 years' time, conquer Quraysh. And he thought that the Prophet ﷺ was going to exact revenge, which was like the custom at the time. If you were wronged in such a violent way, then once you conquer a place, you're going to kind of exact your revenge on them. So he actually ran away from Mecca. He went to Habasha, like what would be in modern day Ethiopia, like it's known as Abyssinia in English. And so he went to those regions to try to escape Mecca because he thought the Prophet was going to come back and kill him and take him prisoner. But because of his past and because of complications and political issues, he was actually sent back and eventually became Muslim. And he was surprised. He said, "I'd never expected the Prophet ﷺ to forgive everyone in Mecca when he opened Mecca." So that's also just a sign of the mercy of the Prophet ﷺ. Nobody expected to be spared when he conquered Mecca. And so Abdullah, the son, coming back to him, he would actually, he was pretty young when he was with the Prophet ﷺ, and he would write down everything. He was literate from the few people who were like very literate from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he would write down everything that the Prophet ﷺ said, all the hadith. And actually some of the Sahaba came to him. There was a time where the Prophet ﷺ, in the very beginning, told people not to write down his hadith. There's two different reasons that are given. Either one, at the very beginning, it didn't want to be confused with the Quran, or the other reason would be that certain people were not qualified. So the Prophet ﷺ just said for most people not to write his hadith, and then specific people he told them to write the hadith. But whatever the case, when he stopped writing hadith, the Prophet ﷺ noticed and he said, "Why did you stop?" And he said, "The people told me to stop." And he said, "No, continue, because I only speak the truth." In huwa illa wahyun yuha, it's a verse in Surah Najm, like he only speaks what's revealed to him. So the Prophet ﷺ only speaks truth. And so then Abdullah continued writing. And he knew so many hadith that Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, said that no one had more narrations than me except for Abdullah, talking about Abdullah bin Amr ibn al-As. And so he said that he would memorize hadith and I would memorize hadith, but he would write hadith and I would not write hadith. So he said that he was the only Sahabi who had more hadith than Abu Hurairah. And the reason we have more hadith from Abu Hurairah than him is because Abu Hurairah stayed in between Mecca and Medina throughout his life, and he dedicated his life to teaching. Whereas Abdullah would go on, he fought in Syria, he fought in Egypt, he also was like in the political affairs of Egypt, and a lot of times, all the time, like the transmission of knowledge is based on the students rather than the teacher themselves. So the teacher can be a phenomenal teacher, but based on the barakah that Allah gives to the students of the teacher, that's how we receive information. So partly because he was dedicating his life to other things, and partly because of the amazing students of Abu Hurairah, there's actually more narrations that reach us from Abu Hurairah. But he had the most memorized. And so he's a pretty huge deal in terms of scholarship. Let's see. And so this is also like another proof against people who say that hadith was written like hundreds of years later. Like this is within the Prophet's time. Just one additional proof to show how hadith was compiled, memorized, and written within his time. And then compiled like after to the students of the Sahaba. And so, let's see here. Yeah, so he narrates another very beautiful hadith. He narrates many hadith. Imam Ahmed actually, in his book, compiles like over 700 narrations from him. But he narrates a hadith that knowledge will actually not be lifted by Allah all at once. That there's many hadith about the end times that knowledge will be lost. He says that knowledge will not be lifted all at once by Allah, but rather that it would be lifted kind of incrementally by the death of scholars. And he says once the scholars decrease and they die out, he says people will start following those who have no knowledge, and they will be misguided and misguide the ummah. And so this is kind of like one of the signs of the end times. So that's kind of the summary a very brief summary of Abdullah. I will be pleased with him. He died in the year either 63 or 68 after Hijrah. So coming back to the hadith itself, so the hadith itself is basically, it's like a very beautiful, like towards the end of this compilation, like these last few hadith are very meaningful because it's like what Imam Nawawi is choosing to bring at the very end. And so here Imam Nawawi has brought all these hadith that mention and try to summarize the essence of Islam. And here this hadith is mentioning that someone hasn't truly attained faith, they haven't truly become Muslim until they have started to align their desires, their inclination towards what Allah wanted, what was revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so, Islam itself is to submit, to surrender. That's like the meaning of Islam, is to submit your will to Allah. And so there's a very beautiful poem in Arabic, the translation of which is the day that you became my master, O Allah, I became the master of the world. And so it's this idea of liberation through servitude towards Allah. Because a lot of times, maybe like growing up in the environment that we grew up here in this society, the idea of submission is seen as something that's degrading, or it's something that's weak or foreign. It's not something that we want. You don't ever want to be submissive to anyone else. And it's kind of comes with this like arrogance, the idea that we have to be self-sufficient, this idea that we have to know everything. If something doesn't make sense to our own minds, then we reject it. And so this is, Islam teaches us something very different. It's to submit our will to Allah, and through that we gain freedom from our desires, we gain freedom from the shackles of this world, from other people. So true freedom is in servitude towards Allah. And so this idea of like serving yourself and this kind of humility that you show towards Allah, that's what's going to free us, inshallah. And it's not about, because a lot of times people use this to kind of like shut down conversations, or people are like asking legitimate questions that they're trying to understand their faith. And then people are like, oh, you just have to submit, like you just have to like not ask any questions. So it's not about silencing your mind. It's not about blind faith, because there's two extremes here. There's like blind faith, and there's also hyper rationality. Hyper rationality is arrogant, because you feel like that your mind needs to understand everything, and everything needs to make sense to your mind before it becomes true. Even though your mind is limited, your perception is limited, you don't know everything, you don't have all information. And on the other hand, there's blind faith, where you don't understand the reasoning behind your religion, you don't understand why something's happening, you're just believing what people say at face value. And Islam is kind of in the middle. It's asking us to think and reflect, look at the world, learn about the world, learn about our religion. And at the same time, there's things in the ghaib, things in the unseen, things that are revealed to us that we have to take because you can't test them. You can't test that, is there an angel on my shoulder? You can't test, like, do I need to pray 4 rak'ats for dhuhr or 5? Like, those are things that are revealed to us, and we take that and we say that we have heard and we obey, inshallah. Islam is essentially, like, the essence of Islam is the Quran, the Sunnah, and the leadership of our scholars. And a lot of times the other problem we also fall into is people are like very happy to accept the Quran. When it comes to the Sunnah or even the opinions of our scholars, people become super hesitant. And there's this beautiful concept of wahi matlu and wahi ghayr matlu. So essentially, wahi means revelation, matlu is something that's recited. So wahi matlu is the Quran itself, the recited revelation. And wahi ghayr matlu is the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because as we mentioned before, in huwa illa wahyun yuha, the Prophet ﷺ was nothing but inspired revelation, essentially. Everything he did, everything he said was inspired by Allah. So his Sunnah is also therefore a revelation to us in a different way than the Quran is, but it's also revelation from Allah. So we can't discredit the Hadith. And these are the sources that, we understand the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the Quran through the scholars that have passed it down to the generations. So all these things come together to give us our Islam. So we can't reject any component of this. It's all very important for us. And anyone who claims to love Allah but then seeks to disobey Allah, it's like a sign of them lying or being a hypocrite. Because if you truly love Allah, then you're going to want to seek His pleasure and also try to fall in line with what they love. Just like if you love anyone else in this world, you try to obey them, you try to follow what they love. And so the same way Allah has told us what He loves for us, and it's all good for us. And so the more that we learn to love Allah, the more that we actually come in line with what He wishes for us in the Sharia. And so the word here used, the kind of critical word here is hawa. So just like a little depth, going into depth on it. Hawa is an inclination or a desire. It's not necessarily bad or good. It could be good or bad. You could have a desire, an inclination towards doing something good, and there's a hadith that use it in this context. And you can also have a desire, an inclination to do something bad. And so this hadith is kind of mentioning this idea of shifting it from the bad to towards the good. And so, because of societal influences, the satanic influences, our own desires, sometimes our desires push us towards doing something that's wrong, or like the antithesis of what Allah is teaching us in the Quran and the Sunnah. And so the idea here is just to make dua and put your effort and spend time in good company so that your desires eventually match that with the Quran and the Sunnah. And there's 4 main points that I'll end on, just so that you can, so that we can kind of gauge ourselves on how we're doing in terms of submitting ourselves towards Allah and obeying Allah. And the first thing, the first point to reflect on is what benefits does this teaching give us? So if you're ever like following anything in the world, like you need to understand like, why am I following this thing? First you would ask yourself, what benefit is it bringing me? And so when you think about Islam, the Quran, the Sunnah, the Hadith, what benefits does this give me? And just reflecting on that will provide some answers. Also, if you stop doing these things, if you stop being Muslim today, what harms would come to you? Obviously in this world and then in the hereafter, just like reflecting on that also gives us a better appreciation of Islam and Allah's will. Also, like another beautiful thing is the character of our teacher, because a lot of times you have people who might sound amazing, the professors, lecturers, speakers, they might sound phenomenal, but then their action doesn't always line up with what they're speaking, and it kind of turns us off from the message itself. And so then we reflect on the character of the Prophet ﷺ, and what does that say about the message of the Prophet ﷺ, and did he act on what he preached or not? And so that's another point to reflect on. And then the last thing is just like the beautifulness of the message itself and the messenger themselves. So like, what are the beautiful characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ, the beautiful characteristics of the Quran, the Hadith, and if we kind of reflect on these points, then we'll gain a kind of deeper appreciation of why we should be Muslim to begin with. It's a very important question, like we all kind of have maybe this understanding of like we're Muslim and it's pretty passive, but if someone came up to you and asked you, why are you Muslim? It's kind of important to have reflected on these points so that we have an answer for ourselves. And so inshallah, may Allah allow us to be from amongst those people whose desires and inclinations line up with His, and may Allah allow us to be free from the shackles of this world and our own desires. Jazakallah khair. See you next week, inshallah.